Welcome to Pittsburgh, everybody. This is a great pleasure. Actually, Lee lied to you. I'm going to introduce Peter. He's going to introduce another person, and we're going to keep this up all through the afternoon. No. I did want to take a couple of minutes to introduce Peter and to set some context. Peter is actually somebody who has had a profound impact on my professional practice in a way that maybe even he doesn't appreciate. But here's what I believe, and I believe this to the core of my being about Pittsburgh, and I believe it about the communities in which you're active as well. In our case, I'm as excited about Pittsburgh as I've ever been. I've lived here for 24 years, and I used to call people back in Washington, D.C. when I came here 24 years ago and say, what in God's name have I done to my career? Because this was a place that talked about itself exclusively in the past tense. So what Bill Peduto shared with you this morning about Pittsburgh as a city that had died, that lived through the psyche of the community. And if you fast forward to today, what you see is a community that is fully engaged, where people believe in a dramatic sense of possibility. And there's an excitement, there's a palpable sense of their ability to make a difference. But here's the truth about this moment in which we find ourselves. And it is that these opportunities that we face and the challenges that we face, the challenges are always going to be with us. But the opportunities, the window that we see to act on them, is a relatively narrow window. So if you think about a global issue like climate change, or your personal challenge, a manifestation of the challenge of social inclusion in your community, on every front that we're working, we have tremendous opportunities to make a difference. We have a new generation of thinkers who are coming along to try and drive a revolution in how we approach those challenges. And we have a few years in which to define a new paradigm. I'm a big believer in countdowns and the fact that time is real. Every year in which we don't act on an issue like school reform is a year in which we lose another group of kids. Every year in which we don't complete a great vision is a year in which we risk it never being completed. And so the excitement and the momentum that you feel in your communities and that we feel in Pittsburgh needs you to rise up to the best of your potential, to take time seriously and get to work. So that's what I believe about our work here. Now, the difficult part is that old power institutions like foundations are not terribly well equipped to deal with that. You know, we've been courting a prominent social entrepreneur and commercial entrepreneur from Boulder in the past few months, and we're trying to get him to come here and do some really exciting work on the food system. And you know, he's interested in being here. And I remember talking with him at one point and saying, I'm going to introduce you to all the foundation leaders in Pittsburgh. And his face looked like, you know, he was polite about it, but it was like, oh, yay, foundations, yay. And the reason was, and we talked about, okay, why? You know, what was behind that? And the reason is, you know, you take this clash of cultures that could not be more profound between you know, basically a guy who comes from the Silicon Valley ethos and is trying to get things out in real time and believes that the first iteration of anything is just the first iteration of anything, up against foundations where we have logic models and theories of change and what's your evaluation plan? And so of course the reaction is yay. Why would I not want to do that? You know what, as I began wrestling with this challenge of social change in our community and how an institution like a foundation can be relevant in the context of dramatic change, which I think is as important for mayors and corporate leaders and anybody in this room who is from a university or a foundation or from government, you're part of an institutional structure that is not configured to operate in that same way. And so as I began to think about how do we deal with this in our community, I came across this book called Little Bets by Peter Sims. And what Peter did for me was introduce me to the concept of human-centered design, which begins with the old-fashioned concept of maybe you should start trying to help people by listening to them, so this idea of empathy, and the notion that the first iteration of anything is only the first iteration of anything, and that we should iterate our way and innovate our way to our solutions rather than trying to outguess destiny and plan for them all ahead. That completely changed my practice. It's a gospel I've been bringing to every task I've had since. I think I've sold more copies of Peter's book than Peter has. I've never gotten a commission, by the way. But the mantra he preaches, I think, is huge. So he describes himself, ironically enough, as an accidental author. Peter is the author of 2 books, so he wrote this book called Little Bets. He also co-authored a very important book on leadership called True North, which is about leading from your principles. Meanwhile, Peter is at the moment he's a co-founder of a group called Silicon Guild, which is trying to just do a little thing like completely reinvent the business publishing industry. And he's helped launch an initiative called Fuse Core, which is trying to bring disruptive, innovative leaders into city-based contexts. And he's launched a thing called Black Sheep, which is all about creating mashups like this, where people from all different walks of life interested in innovation get to sit around a table and figure out what that looks like for their community. And he's about to have a baby. And I don't think he has enough to do. He's clearly underemployed. So if you want him to come and talk in your community, I'm sure he'd be willing to do that. Listen, it's a great honor to introduce somebody who I think, as we struggle with how the institutions that we represent and lead can be relevant in a period of disruptive change, this guy knows how. So it's a pleasure to welcome him to CEOs for Cities and Pittsburgh. Peter.
Oh, thank you so much for that humbling introduction. And I am truly honored to be here today with a group of people I had dinner with last night and all of you to share a bit about this book, Little Bets, and maybe a few other things that we have going around the country. But as I mentioned to some folks I had dinner with last night, Pittsburgh has been hovering in my consciousness through a lot of articles and stories that I hear about the reinvention of a city. And having spent a lot of time in Detroit, Detroit was always looking up to Pittsburgh. Truly, this, to me, is ground zero for a very, very important renewal that's desperately needed in America. And it's started, as Grant alluded, but there's so much to be done to make sure that this energy and this renaissance of sorts that's happening in the downtown cascades outwards and builds. And we are at a very, very challenging point in American history right now, unless we happen to be, like those of us in this room, fortunate. I grew up in a small town in Northern California, and my cousin is a logger. My uncle is a logger, and my cousin had a very serious bout of addiction with meth. And he talks very openly about this now, so he's comfortable with me talking about it. But if you look at what's going on in rural America, or if you look at what's going on in parts of urban America that have been not brought under the same tent, it's a crisis time. People are dying because of these challenges. And it's really incumbent upon us to rethink how we're going about social problem solving, how we're going about reinventing and bringing new jobs into the national economy. And the actual answer in my travels is not Barack Obama. It's not another Bush or Clinton. The answer is actually surprisingly simple. It's actually you and me and us. And so anyway, I want to share a bit about some work that I've done on this book on innovation. We'll share some examples across many different walks of life, from comedy to how Pixar develops its movies to entrepreneurship. I'm at heart a true entrepreneur from the Silicon Valley, and as I tell people today on Facebook, the answer to America's reinvention from a mindset standpoint is not Silicon Valley, it's Pittsburgh, it's Detroit, it's the places where people are putting place above self. It doesn't happen in my neck of the woods. I want more people to understand what the challenges that my Uncle Joe, who's a logger, are experiencing to get out of their bubbles. So anyway, those are a few of the themes I want to share about, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions and hopefully have some fun and laughter, because clearly at some point I'll have to introduce 6 people to join me up here, which was not the plan, but I'm very happy to engage in any type of improvised experiment that we want here. So this book, Little Bets, came about because I don't know, how many of you think of yourselves, have thought of yourselves as creative? You just say, I'm a creative. So, well, okay, so 40% of the room. I got a C in art in my 7th grade class. I never thought of myself as creative for many years until I got exposed to some new ways of thinking, and ended up just feeling passionate to write this book because it was sort of a mindset that I learned from some teachers that changed all that. So I'll just tell you briefly about this, the origins of this book, and here we are on a slide that's how I became an accidental author, as Grant mentioned, when I met a person named Bill George, who is a former CEO who wanted to write about authentic leadership and wrote a book called Authentic Leadership. And while I was in my late 20s, I was wrestling with how to connect my values with what I did for work. And so that work of becoming authentic, authenticity and leadership was really appealing. We ended up co-authoring this book together called True North, Discover Your Authentic Leadership. And I want to share with you one of the key lessons we learned in doing the research for this book. So we ended up having a chance to talk with very extended interviews, 130 leaders, ranging from people you would have heard of, like Howard Schultz of Starbucks, and some others, down to people who were in their 20s. And we just wanted to ask them, what were the key experiences in your personal and professional life that shaped you? And so with the patterns that we found in sifting through these interviews was that, first of all, life and leadership are not linear, right? So when we're young, we think, oh, there's just going to be this, I'm going to go do the best work I can and get a good grade and keep progressing up and up and up. And life, of course, is completely opposite from that. It's full of twists and turns and ups and downs. So the early years, our 20s, are typically trying some different jobs, new experiences, seeing what we like, what we don't like, seeing what our interests are, seeing what we're good at, trying a lot of different things. We call that stage rubbing up against the world, which came from one of our interviewees. And what we found is that for people who are above the age of 40, who we interviewed, every one of them, except for 2 or 3, had a dramatic, what we call crucible experience. Now, this term crucible comes from a leadership scholar, Warren Bennis, who says that you really learn what you're made of as a leader and develop self-awareness when you go through the harshest challenges in life. The loss of a job, the death of a loved one, a moment in time when all of your beliefs are challenged and you're left kind of reeling by an experience. So it can be severe, it can also be less than dramatic. It can be just a job that doesn't suit you well, that forces you to come to a much clearer sense of what your values are. So the crucibles tended to be the experiences that shape people the most, which is kind of ironic because they were periods in their careers or their lives where there was a very steep decline and as if all was lost. But then after that, as people gain more self-awareness through those crucibles, they tend to be much more effective at connecting with other people because it's less them focusing on themselves and their own egoic needs and much more just a sense of comfort in their own skin. So do people think of crucibles, does that connect with some of the experiences in your lives? Great. So at the end, I'll leave time for questions if you want to talk about this, but we just found that crucibles kind of shaped this shift that people went through from being really I-focused to we-focused. So that was a key insight from our learnings there, and that we're all shaped by our stories in life. So Howard Schultz of Starbucks grew up in the projects of Brooklyn, and his father lost his job and all of his insurance when he was around 7 years old, and Howard had to answer the phone at night to tell the bill collectors to go away. Young kid, imagine the burden on his shoulders. But when he was at Starbucks and in a position to give healthcare benefits to employees, that was important to him as a result. So our stories really inform how we are motivated and how we lead. So I'm not going to go into more detail on True North, but happy to answer any questions. This is the D school at Stanford. This is the design school at Stanford, where this guy, George Kemble, taught me how to think in terms of prototypes and how to think in terms of lots and lots of small bets rather than trying to plan things out in life. I had before that been, maybe some of you can relate, very comfortable solving known problems, but not so comfortable figuring out how to solve problems that I didn't even know existed, right? So how do you create data to solve new problems and find problems before you even solve them? It's creating something from scratch, and this is what design teaches. So they say around there's no mistake. You just constantly are learning through this iterative process. And what's more, as Grant mentioned, empathy is at the core of design thinking. How do you truly understand the needs of the people you're trying to serve, whether it's with a social venture or a company? And there are a number of principles to teach how to do that. And ultimately, this book is all about how to share that mindset with others to unlock their creativity, because I think our educational system robs us of this sense that you can go out and try a lot of things and fail and be imperfect, and actually that's a good thing, because that's how invention happens. And you need only look at companies in Silicon Valley to see where this happens every day. So this is the first version of YouTube, which was started as a dating website. You may not know that. Starting as a dating video sharing site, and it was started by two people who had worked for PayPal. So they had to figure out that wasn't going to work, and happened fairly quickly, but they had to try it first. Google began as a project by Larry Page and Sergey Brin to figure out how to search for and prioritize library books. When you typed in a term for a topic, let's say you typed in a term for Heinz, you look at how many other books and sources pointed to certain books to determine which one should be elevated to the top. So that basic algorithm was what was used to do online information search. They didn't intend that to happen. They just stumbled into that over time by a series of steps. This is the first Starbucks logo that Howard Schultz used for the company. Was called Il Journal. He had gone to Europe and he had experienced these coffee houses in Milan that were communal, and people were engaged around this set of conversations with coffee at the center of it. And he said, I really want to bring that back to the United States. So he brought this truly Italian brand back to the US, and the first store had nonstop opera music playing like it would have in Italy, and it had the baristas all wearing bow ties, which they hated. And there were a couple other things. One was the menus were all in Italian, and no chairs. No chairs is the other. So imagine that. So as Howard says, had to make a lot of mistakes to figure out what would work. This is the entrepreneurial process, right? I mean, there are a number of entrepreneurs here, right? This is just how it works. Again, completely opposite from what we're taught. We're taught to have the right answer. We're taught to be perfect. It's the antithesis of how invention actually happens. And the research is pretty conclusive on that statement, actually. And some of the research I enjoy sharing about is from those who study the creative process of everyone from artists to musicians to entrepreneurs, engineers. And David Galenson at Chicago has found that there are two basic types of innovators. And one type of innovator is Mozart. And Mozart could, according to historians, he could take an entire symphony of music in his mind and put it down on paper and make very few changes between that and what was the ultimate finished product. Whether that's true, completely true or not, you know, historians can debate that, but Galenson says this guy was what he would call a conceptual innovator. He could put it all in his mind before putting it on paper and have it be pretty conceptually clear and consistent. These types of innovators, these conceptual innovators, tend to be doing their best work when they're young. These are prodigies. And you know, what Galenson has found is what's much more common are experimental innovators, as he calls them. So experimental innovators would be somebody like Beethoven. So Beethoven would go through draft after draft of his work, and if you study his manuscripts, they're all pockmarked with, you know, his pen quill had just even poked through the paper. You can imagine him just frustrated at night working on these things. And he was constantly experimenting with his work, trying different things out, but he got to obviously pretty remarkable products. So the key to experimental innovation, most people, this is what Galenson finds much, much more interesting than conceptual innovators, is you have to be willing to persist and develop that resilience to go through the creative process. So again, that's at odds with this education that we have been given, right? So how do we develop that mindset when we're not used to having to be imperfect to get to a solution? And that's where really started to get into trying to understand like another set of problems. So this is planning, right? This is a PowerPoint slide. I wanted to find some way of describing the problem, some of the problems that we have in our organizations today. And PowerPoint cultures are so big, right? I mean, how many people in here work in an organization where you have to have a perfect PowerPoint before you can move forward with an idea? I mean, it has to be just perfect, or a perfect plan, a perfect... None? So you guys are all reached the promised land. Okay, that's great. Well, this slide is actually taken from a presentation that was given to Stanley McChrystal when he was leading the Afghanistan war effort, and it was put together by his staff. So this is typical kind of Army stuff right here, right? All of the inputs and all the factors that can determine success in how to win the war in Afghanistan put onto one PowerPoint slide, right? So this is an example of completely, and John Stewart had a field day with this when he said, you know, that's all right here. Okay, so you want your answer, it's all right here. It's so confusing, and I can't even understand some of the major categories they're talking about there. This is deductive logic. This is, we think we can deduce variables into predictable ways of planning around that. And the reality is when you're doing something new or in a chaotic environment such as warfare or you know, a new initiative, you can't plan it. So what's a different mindset? I say this experimentation versus planning. The first HP calculator, which came out in 1972, the HP 35, was, now how many people in here recognize that calculator? Okay. It's okay. Did anybody own the first one? Now that's courage. That's great. Valedictorian in your college class? Was it a grad school class or was it a undergraduate? Okay, no, that person's probably running the world these days. The calculator was priced at $395 then, at 72. So today's term is about $2,000. And the substitute was a slide rule. Now, Many people in this room may not know what a slide rule is. Many people may, right? So there's a slight generational gap there, but I've never used or seen a slide rule. This was not the type of idea that if you put into a plan or a spreadsheet would seem to be well positioned for success, right? So HP hired SRI, they went out and did the research, they came back and they said, this thing can't sell. It's too expensive, the slide rule's the alternative, it can't sell. Now, Bill Hewlett, who was of Hewlett and Packard, Bill Hewlett was known as the more kind of creative, entrepreneurial type of the two. David Packard was a phenomenal leader and a phenomenal operator, but Hewlett worked with the R&D team at HP. He had been on a plane with the prototype for this thing, and he just talked with a guy, a random person, and the guy said he would buy one. So one data point, and Hewlett gets back, he hears that somebody would buy it, and he says, so let's just build 1,000 and see what happens. I don't care what SRI said, let's just build 1,000 and see what happens. And of course, we know that this was a success, but it was a huge success, and nearly immediately. I mean, they were selling 1,000 of these a day within a few months. It almost actually, truth be told, almost put Hewlett-Packard out of business from a working capital standpoint because it was growing so quickly. None of this could have been predicted because the data didn't exist. So this is an example of an experimental mindset versus the planning mindset. And so when you dig into the research on how different types of people make decisions, it should come as no surprise that for those of us who have been educated to think in terms of determining what we can gain from an idea before we start, return on investment, IRR, what have you, we tend to have this planning mindset where we always think about what we can expect to gain. The great researcher from University of Virginia says the expert entrepreneurs don't think about what they can expect to gain when they're doing something new. They use a completely different mindset. They think about what they can afford to lose. Hewlett could afford to lose 1,000 calculators for the potential reward that would come after. This is the basis for this concept, which is at the center of this book, which is Little Bets, which is to say when you're doing something new, think about what you can afford to lose. Can you lose an hour? Can you lose $100? Can you lose $1,000 on an idea in order to learn what the problems are? Because when you're in the unknown or the opportunities are, you can't predict that. So why should we be using a mindset that's best suited for when you know what you're doing and you can predict the variables involved? So when you're in the unknown, think in terms of small bets and little bets. And when you know that you have found something that is solving the right problems, then bet big. I don't care if it's a meeting or a new company or what have you, a new product, a new idea, a new PowerPoint presentation. So that's one of the core principles. How can you think in terms of what you can afford to lose? And as a result, you have to be willing to fail. You have to be willing to be imperfect. Hewlett said you'd have to make 100 of these small bets before you got to roughly 6% of them would become breakthroughs. So the question is, are you making small bets? Is this a part of your daily ritual? How many people in here would say that on a daily basis they make small bets? Again, it's pretty good number. So are most of you entrepreneurial types? I mean, I want to know, like, what, because entrepreneurs have to be doing that on a daily basis. How many people work in an established big institution and make small bets on a regular basis? Okay, you're on the panel. We're going to get you guys up here. No. Okay, so that's, and which institution is it, sir?
Cleveland State University.
Okay, and the culture there is permissive of that?
No, you find the niches where you just bust on through and then apologize later.
Good. Okay, that's great. You're what we would call a black sheep. That's great. So you have to ask.
And lost my job. I'm moving to
Celebrate that. Let's celebrate that. We need more of that. That's great. Well, so the question becomes, what is failure? Maybe that would be failure.
No, that's success.
That's success. Okay. Go Buckeyes. Comedians face this challenge actually every day. So how many people here have seen how a stand-up comedian develops a new act? Is this something that you've seen? Just one. Okay, that's so. When Chris Rock is working on a new act, he goes to a comedy club that's right next to his house in New Jersey, and he shows up very casually dressed. He's in jeans and a hat, and he's almost unrecognizable. He walks in, and people say, "Oh, that's Chris Rock." Maybe 50 or 60 people there, and he asks if he can get on stage, and he is given that, usually the next spot or the couple spots down the line. He gets up and he sits on a stool, and he's not the Chris Rock we're used to on HBO, but he's there riffing on very rough ideas that he's written down on his knee. And one of the first things he tells people is, put away your cell phones. Don't record this because I don't want this on YouTube because it's going to be ugly. So fortunately, there is a great documentary that's called The Comedian. And the comedian follows Jerry Seinfeld as he is trying to develop a new stand-up act after he's already world famous and 100 millionaire plus a few years back. And this is a scene that we're going to show from one of his early performances as part of that development process to get to, again, the goal is just to get to 1 hour worth of good material, okay? So if we could cue the video.
Next guy to the stage, it's been a pleasure to watch him grow in the last few months. How about a big hand for Jerry Seinfeld, everybody?
That's what people always say to me, it must be so easy. It's not easy.
What's easy?
For me now, because
Right.
people know who I am.
No, you get a little bit of a break up front.
Yeah.
And then you still gotta be funny. That's the beauty of stand-up, though. That's why it's closest to justice. Not that it's just ultimately, but it's close to justice. Because even Jack Nicholson, wherever he looks,
Right.
he's in the middle of a comedy show where we give him 5 minutes of grace.
Right.
And then he'd be like, okay, Jack, you know, if you're not making us laugh, get going. You know what I mean? And he's the most beloved person there is.
Right.
So in the end, whatever it is, whether it's 3 dates or 7 dates, you're still irritated. Still annoyed, still frustrated, still hating the whole experience all the way through. And now my point here is my point. God I got off on that whole thing about the number. Oh, damn it. I don't know. I don't know. What was it about? And I didn't even want to say what I just said. That's the ugly part. I don't remember. Anyway, there's something good there.
Is this your first gig?
Yeah, yes it is. Well, you know, doing all this stuff I had never said before to anyone. It's just thoughts. So this is how comedians develop material.
Right.
And as you can see, it's quite painful.
So, pretty awkward, right? Surprising? This is the comedy, this is what all stand-up comedians have to do. And so, at one point in that documentary, again called The Comedian, if you want to see it, Seinfeld says, for the average person to understand what my job is like every day, they would have to go to work in their underwear. He's that vulnerable. He's just that stripped of you know, it's a very humbling position to be in, but it gets better as the process goes on, and then after 6 months to a year, he'll have an hour that's so perfect he can go anywhere in America and know that it's going to work. He's tried it in all different types of clubs all around different regions, And it's just constantly getting better with each time he gets up. He's looking for a little germ of an idea that can be iterated on, and he looks at certain people in the audience even to know who are the kind of lead adopters, the most active comedy watchers, to see their reactions and nods, and picks up on that and keeps working it night after night after night. Again, this is not what we're not really taught to do this. This is learned through experiences, but we do have statistics on the number of tries that the Onion has to go through to come up with 18 headlines every week, and so the headline works for you. It's yeah, I got a kick out of that too. Again, very low success rate, 3%, right? So sometimes I get asked, well, what percentage of my time should I be thinking about making these small bets? And I always come up with an answer that's roughly 5 to 10%, right? None of us can be doing this all the time, but if we're not experimenting at least some of the time, if we're not thinking in terms of affordable losses, if we're not out trying a new collaboration to see what happens, then we're never going to do anything creative. And I think Sir Ken Robinson said that best. If you're not willing to be imperfect, you'll never do anything creative. So, again, from my experience, when I was growing up, my parents stressed getting good achievements, getting good grades, doing well in sports, and it turns out the research on where creativity comes from and where the willingness, there's research on mindsets by Carol Dweck out of Stanford that some of you may be familiar with because she's become quite well known for her work in education circles, shows that from a young age we tend to get a type of mindset which will affect our response to failure and setbacks. So if we are only given praise for our achievements and for things we do well, like grades, we tend to have more of a fixed mindset. Praising the result, fixed mindset. You're attached to the result. You think you're a kid, you think you're going to be loved because your parents are praising, or your parents, your teachers, your coaches are praising results. And so what Dweck has found is that certain kids, when they didn't do well on a test, and they're third graders, if they don't do well on a test, their fixed mindset, they don't want to take that test again because they don't want it to reflect poorly upon them, and they don't want to feel less loved or appreciated. So, but other kids take a test, they don't do well, and they say, give me the test again tomorrow, because they believe that their abilities and their intelligence can be grown through hard work. And so what Dweck has found with kids all the way through CEOs and race car drivers and everything else is that the growth mindset is driven by praising the process, praising the hard work you went through to get the grades, the practice for sports or what have you. And so, you know, somebody who was praised for achievement, I think I had a great aversion to failure. I think that's quite common in our culture. And so what Dweck has found is that anybody can move on the spectrum from fixed to growth mindset. And the ways that that happens are threefold. One is you look at role models who had to go through a lot to get a stronger capacity. The second thing is to think about experiences you've had where you had to overcome significant odds to be able to grow your abilities. And then the third thing is to try a lot of little things that won't be perfect, but that will strengthen that muscle of being willing to take setbacks and use them to learn to get to the next stage. So any of us can develop a growth mindset. Seinfeld has a growth mindset, but it's terribly hard for him to put himself out there night after night. It just gets easier as his creative process goes on. So this is a slide that just shows what the Pixar creative process is. So Pixar has a movie coming out called Inside Out, I guess, next week. It took 5 years to make. The first 2 years are spent doing these, what's called storyboards. And so the way it works is people work on ideas, they scribble them onto these note cards, and they come up with dialogue that they then act out with a pointer stick in front of their colleagues. And they do this until they come up with enough to be able to show the comic book version of the movie which is just taking all these storyboards and putting them together in a film that's a very rough film that they show to their team. And when they're in that context, they use one principle that's the most important principle. It's called plussing. And so plussing is when you take an idea and, well, actually, this is a quote that I want to share first. So the founder of Pixar, the co-founder of Pixar, Ed Catmull, says that, you know, we always go from suck to non-suck in our movies, which is an elegant way of putting it. He's just basically making the point that their movies are bad, at least for the first couple years, always. They always are full of problems. They don't make sense, but they just keep pushing. And the way they keep pushing is through this technique called plussing, which I was alluding to. And so this is a storyboard from the first Toy Story. And it's a storyboard with the main character, Woody, and a dog, as you can see. And you can also see that Woody in this storyboard is somewhat angry, or he's frowning. And so for a long time, as they were developing the first movie, Woody was an angry character. He was not a nice guy. And it turns out that was not working. It just wasn't working. That was a big problem that they had to fix. And so the way they would fix a problem like this on a storyboard using plussing is they would say something like, I like the dog licking Woody's foot, and what if Woody were a friendly character? It's a very simple example, but I'm just sharing it with you because it's such a simple idea. Plussing is just taking principles from improvisation. Instead of using judgmental language to just assault something, you say, yes, and what if we did this? And I tell you, I've spent a lot of time at Pixar. This is how it works there. They just are constantly plussing each other's ideas. And it's not that they're not laser focused on making an idea better, it's just that they're not assaulting each other. They're not saying but, and they're not, you know, yeah, I like that, but, you know, it's not a really good idea. It's built on this belief that in improvisation, you can use a positive set of words to build creative ideas. And at the early stages of developing ideas, that makes a big difference. Now, who works in an environment where that is not the case, where there is a lot of criticism and no idea is a good idea? Because I know that there are some people in here who work in that type of environment. So there's another term that I'll share that you might enjoy. It's called the hippo phenomenon. This comes from Google. The hippo phenomenon is when the highest paid person's opinion, hippo, is the only one that matters, right? So team can spend as much time as it wants on something, but the hippo comes along and makes that the final decision. So are there any hippos in the room? We can see on these questions. Oh, Bill, you're a hippo? I would never have guessed that. Such an enlightened person. Anyway, this is a set of mindsets that can allow for more collaborative problem solving. And when you're dealing with creativity, if you're interested in creativity, it's really important to get some of these things right, and we can learn from what Pixar's done. So this is the true story of how Pixar came to be, and you may or may not know this story, but I'm going to share it with you because it gets into a lot of other ideas that this book describes, and then we can take some of your questions after we go through this and a couple other finishing thoughts. But Pixar began as a hardware company. So in the 1980s, a guy by the name of Ed Catmull wanted to make a full-length digital film. And there was no technology to support that dream. So he was a technologist, and he went to work for this company, Pixar, which was part of Lucasfilm. So George Lucas had made Star Wars. He was, Empire Strikes Back. He was an innovator when it came to digital special effects, and he thought they should have the capacity inside of the company to do this. And so these are the machines they used. Now, in order to demonstrate the value of these machines, Ed Catmull decided one of the ways they could do that was to make a short film. A short animated film, no dialogue, very short film, And he hired somebody to work with him on that film, who was John Lasseter, guy who had been fired from Disney as an animator from Disney because, like you, sir, he was too much of a rebel-rouser. He was fired from Disney. Great mistake in the history of Disney. And he was hired by this hardware company, and so he helps make this short film. And as you can see, the animation is not very precise. It's just using the basic geometric shapes, no dialogue. And they go to show this film to a group that's called CETA, which is kind of like this group. It's an industry convening group. And the people at CETA think it's cool. It demonstrates the value of what Pixar is doing on the hardware side. Then something happens. George Lucas goes through a divorce. He needs money. So he goes to a lot of people to try to sell this company. He goes to GM. He goes to Ross Perot. He goes to Silicon Valley and makes the rounds. And at the end of that process, there's only one person standing to buy the company. We all know who that was. Jobs, Steve Jobs. And so Steve Jobs buys Pixar. He buys Pixar for $5 million. $5 million for the company. It goes to George Lucas, $5 million in working capital to support this hardware company. And when Steve Jobs bought Pixar, Ed Catmull and John Lasseter were so passionate about animation that one of the first things they did was go to him and say, can we make another short animated film? And Jobs gave his permission because George Lucas had told him, I just want you to know, Steve, these guys are hell-bent on digital animation. And he says he understands that, he appreciates their passion, but Steve Jobs never anticipated that Pixar would be a film company when he bought them. He thought Pixar was going to be the next great hardware company. He thought Pixar was going to be the next Hewlett-Packard. Steve Jobs, the visionary of our times, thought that. They make this film, Luxo Jr. It's about two lamps interacting with each other over a popped beach ball. So the basic storyline is this small lamp hops on this ball and pops the ball. And only through squeaking noises, no dialogue, is sad and turns to the adult lamp, and there's an exchange of squeaks. And the baby lamp gets distracted by something else and hops away before too long, and that's basically the end of the short. So anyway, you had to be there, I guess. So I always wonder if I should put that link in instead of describing it, but I kind of like the description. But here's the thing, there are people in the audience who are just crying watching this thing. I mean, it's like just two lamps, right? And they're crying watching these things. I definitely didn't cry when I watched it. But the point was, and Jobs was sitting in the back watching all this, they thought the lamps were human. So somehow they had tapped into something really interesting. And so Jobs is sitting there in back watching this and saying, we're trying to sell this hardware. We're going everywhere to try to sell this hardware. But these lamps, people are crying in this conference because of two lamps. And so they're onto something interesting. So they know they're onto something interesting. It's a small bet in the scheme of Pixar as a hardware company to make these short films. And as Ed Catmull says, Steve Jobs was their protector. He was the one who funded doing these short films. They did another the next year. Now, they also had to make the hardware. The hardware was their hardware. They had to make the software, rather, to do these short films. And so the software got more and more advanced to the point where they could sell the software. And so because they weren't able to sell the hardware, it was just too expensive, and they didn't find a market for the hardware, Steve Jobs stood up in front of the whole company in about 1987, and he said, we're going to be the next great software company. And he really believed that Pixar was onto something with this software that could really sell. It was very tough going. They had to fire 50 people around Silicon Valley. There was all this questioning with Steve Jobs, just another one-hit wonder. It was really tense time for the company. And all the while, Catmull and Lasseter are emotionally invested in these short films because they're getting better and better at this digital animation and this digital storytelling. And so they go to Jobs and they pitch him on another short film that would be in 1988, at a time when Jobs is actually trying to sell the company. He's calling Larry Ellison of Oracle and Bill Gates and Ross Perot again, and really interesting technologists. We're onto something with all this animation, but I need to sell. He had invested $50 million as the huge protector of Pixar, and nobody would buy it. So, and I always wish I could be Pixar for this one moment in time when Lasseter and Catmull are pitching this idea for this short film in 1988, and there's all this tension in the room, and Steve Jobs is being told he's crazy to keep supporting these short films because it makes no money for the business, getting pressure from different parts of the company, and Jobs gives permission to make this film called Tin Toy, 5 minutes, 10 seconds long. This short film won the Academy Award for short films that year. It was a huge story. And after that, Steve Jobs said, we're going to be the next great film company. And he marched to Disney and used this short film as the pitch for what would become a much larger film, Toy Story. So that was how they figured out how to get to the big screen. It all happened through these small incremental steps where they had to learn each piece of the puzzle, and they were convinced that this is what they wanted to do. They had a lot of what you might think of as small wins, right? So what small wins are you able to piece together to work towards a larger dream? But you have to dream big, and that's why I love this story, is that who would have ever expected this would have been possible? Everybody said it was insane and crazy, and so they, in very kind of low-risk way, were able to develop out all the different pieces until they could finally bet on something big. So for that, they have my endless respect. And around Pixar, a director there, Brad Bird, when he came to the company, Pixar had already made 2 films that were both blockbuster films. And at the time, Catmull and John Lasseter and Steve Jobs told Brad Bird their biggest concern was that Pixar was going to become complacent. And by the way, this is still Catmull's #1 concern. I just saw him earlier this week. He's terrified that Pixar is going to become complacent. And so Brad Bird was a guy who's just kind of a very creative director. He came in and he had very ambitious ideas for a movie that all the technical people at Pixar told him was impossible. And so Bird said, I know we can do this. He said, but I want the black sheep at Pixar. I want the people who are the artists who are thinking differently to help rethink how we do things like set design and how we can replicate, background characters and whatnot. And they ended up making the movie. It was called The Incredibles. And they made it for less money per minute than Finding Nemo because they used so many new techniques and approaches. And to this day, Brad Bird is constantly seeking out the black sheep at Pixar, and Pixar is always looking for people inside Pixar who can challenge the status quo. So that, to me, is a sign of a great organization. And I know that there are many people in this room who are black sheep. So this idea of black sheep has resonated across the country and increasingly across the world. We started out making T-shirts and hats just out of admiration for this. And it has since grown into, I don't know what you would call it. It's a motley group of creative entrepreneurs, everyone from entrepreneurs to truck drivers to artists. And we did a bus tour around America with the Black Sheep, which is now a foundation. And we stopped in Pittsburgh, and we met with a number of people across the spectrum in Pittsburgh. I was unfortunately not able to be here that day because, as was mentioned, my wife is quite pregnant. And so a number of people here at this table for sure were part of that. And we find with this bus tour that there are people all around America who, despite the odds, are reinventing themselves and their organizations. And we took this route over a 20-day period, and we had a film team, and we had photographers and writers, and we're producing a book and documentary about all this so that we can bridge the empathy gap in America. But here's a building in Detroit where it's called the Russell Industrial Center, where there used to be publishing firms occupying all these floors. And today, when you go in there, it looks like it's out of like the Middle East or something there. You go in there, there are people like this guy, Alan Conyers, who is, I've come to know, a craftsman of the highest order. And he, for many years, was renovating kitchens and living rooms with furniture throughout Detroit. And of course, that whole economy has, that whole line of opportunity has gone away. And so what he has done is to try to make really high-end furniture. So that chair that you see in back is an example of his work, and it's just beautiful. And what's even more inspiring to me about Alan is that he is one of two people who have been in this Russell building the longest. And the Russell building is today full of artists and entrepreneurs across race, across any type of background, who he is helping to mentor and helping to support. He teaches at the local university, and he doesn't make a huge killing doing it, but I asked him, I said, what's your mission? And he said, my mission is to stay in business. And he actually is really starting to thrive with this furniture. So we want to hear stories like those, and we also want to think about how we can, with this very fortunate group of people that's gathered around the Black Sheep, whether they be foundation heads or business executives, people who identify as having a big creative side, how can we help support the reinvention of this, of America? I mean, it's just crucial to be able to support that. So anyway, these are some of the Black Sheep values, which are just a general set of creative values, and this is our team. That's the mayor of Louisville, and the guy pictured in the center there is Harold O'Neill, the guy with the mayor, and he's a pianist. He got his picture taken with every mayor. Was a big highlight for him. So Harold and the mayor. But here is where I'm from, just to wrap things up, and this is the Bay Area, San Francisco. The traffic is like LA now. It's a nightmare. The economy is booming. Technology descending into San Francisco, and it's just this, you know, I sit around at a dinner party and people are all talking about, you know, robotics and like the future where you don't have to work. It sounds like, you know, just this ridiculous dream world. You know, and at the same time, my uncle is sitting just 2 hours away in his logging truck, which he says there's the best corner office in the world. And he loves the nature and everything. But, you know, in these times, you know, this is not an easy economy for Uncle Joe. And I'm sure many of you have Uncle Joe or Aunt Liz or Cousin Nick in your lives. And it's when I think we need to get out of our bubbles and really get to the other sides of America to bring our networks, our resources, our talents to try to help really rethink how we're going about things. So this group here has a whole set of ideas that came out of conversations they've been having over a long period of time about bringing together the business community into a lot of these conversations that you're having. And we, the Black Sheep, want to support that, and we want to try to help bring a Fuse Corps fellow to work between the mayor's office and the business community to really rethink how can we think about a long-term plan here to bring more people and jobs into the economy. So that's again, back to the beginning theme, that's where the change is happening. It's right here, it's local. The power is in your hands, in our hands. It's not somebody who's gonna come give it to us on a white horse. So I hope that you think about how Alan Kay says the best way to predict the future is to invent it, and that we are all the inventors of the future, and it starts really small. It's really simple with these small bets. So thank you for listening to all that. Meandering a little bit there, but listen, it's really a treat and privilege to be here, and if I can answer any questions that you might have about what I've shared, I would love to be able to over the next, I guess maybe, I don't know, 10 minutes, or people have 10 minutes? And I'm going to get to your city dividends thing too. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
We have microphones out there, so anybody who wants to raise their hand, go ahead. Hi, my name is Daniel Regan. I'm with Cambar Properties from Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm also the son of a metal sculptor. So thinking of creatives in our community, one thing that has been my experience knowing a lot of artists is there's a disconnect between both sides of the brain. So if you're really good and really creative, it's often hard to implement that from an operational perspective. And you know, Hewlett and Packard are you know, a great example of that in your presentation. So from your perspective, as people in our community that you know can hopefully bridge some gaps, what's the best way to do that? How can you make that connection between those dichotomous perspectives?
Great question. So artists and you know, artists tend to hang out with artists, right? And then foundation heads hang out with foundation. And so I think this idea of silos is a huge, big problem that a lot of people in this room are thinking about, right? And how do you break that apart and create a common? So what we do with Black Sheep is we try to create a common sense of place, right? We say, whether you're Rick Kirkland at McKinsey or Harold O'Neill, the pianist, you're part of this community, and you're Black Sheep, right? You share something. Rick he's in a band at night, and so he has a creative side that needs to be nourished. And there are a lot of people for whom that applies. And then there are a lot of artists who just need to understand the business side. And so he needs to be learning with Rick, and Rick needs to plug him into certain advisors. So I think it takes a community approach in many of these cases for artists to find patrons, right? And patrons to find the artists. So that's one of the things that comes to mind. And then, yeah, in any company, what I found in the organizational research is that you have to be able to maintain a balance between really, really effective execution and operations and the willingness to be experimental and creative. And so Hewlett and Packard had that. Steve Jobs had that with Tim Cook. You know, you look at these great partnerships that form. At GE, Jeff Immelt is the execution guy. His colleague Beth Comstock is the creative, innovative force. So we have to find those partnerships, I think, and friendships. And the event last night, I don't know if folks went to that, but that event last night was bringing people together across all those boundaries. So what CEO for Cities is doing with the Arts Council here and the Technology Council here is very innovative in that way. I don't know, I hope that answers your question, or starts to. Thank you. So we should talk about your city dividends briefly.
Talk about it.
So this example of city dividends, are people familiar with city dividends? That's an example of this small bet approach that you know, you guys have developed and put forward. And it seems to be that a lot of times in the institutional world, there's always an ask for like a theory of change, right? Or what's the, you know, how can we see all the impact measuring out? And that tends to come, you know, as a very strong mindset. And so my theory of change is just to get shit done, right? So it's just like, how can you make things happen as quickly as possible? And the way to do that, I think, is with a lot of small incremental steps. So isn't that what City Dividends is about?
Yep, it is. You got it.
Awesome.
Okay,
so
great.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Peter Sims.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.